Establishing central influence immediately grants white options and pressure. Developing the knight to a central square immediately prepares for pawn advances and contests space effectively. Solidifying the d4 pawn's defense and preparing for kingside castling are key goals behind this development. Instigating the king's Indian setup, this pawn push prepares to fianchetto the bishop, creating an imposing diagonal aimed at white's kingside. Solidifying central control and preparing to expand on the queenside, creating a symmetrical pawn structure for now. Developing the bishop to its longest diagonal, the king's protection initiates a solid fianchetto setup. Solidifying central control, this knight squarely targets the d5 square and prepares for kingside castling. Solidifying the central structure and preparing kingside castling, d6 embraces a flexible pawn formation. Solidifying the center opens new attacking avenues for white's pieces. Securing the monarch's safety initiates development and prepares the army for the central battle ahead. Solidifying the center's pawn structure allows for graceful development and prepares potential kingside expansion. Developing the knight to d7 supports the central pawn push of e5 and prepares for potential piece maneuvers on the queenside. Casting ensures king's safety and readies pieces for central engagement. Solidifying the center and preparing for a queenside expansion, black reinforces the pawn chain. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this move preempts potential knight forks and future dark square threats. Initiating central pawn liberation now creates immediate dynamic possibilities and challenges white's e4 pawn. This placement develops the bishop to a natural square, aiming to control the d4-e5 diagonal and prepare for further kingside expansion or a central push. The queen now eyes the h4 square, potentially eyeing a kingside attack or supporting a central pawn push. A bold territorial advance that aims to seize central space, potentially restricting black's piece mobility. Opening the queenside diagonal for the bishop solidifies black's central pawn structure, creating a tense, locked position. Securing the queenside pawn structure against potential breakthroughs now becomes paramount for white. Unleashing the knight on the edge aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially create outpost opportunities. Shifting the rook to support the central pawn thrust and prepare for potential operations along the e-file demonstrates a flexible approach to controlling critical squares. Initiating a knight sortie to f4 challenges the central pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's solid pawn chain. Unlocking the queenside initiative begins with repositioning the bishop, preparing for potential pawn advances and controlling crucial diagonals. Solidifying pawn structure and preparing for potential kingside action by preventing immediate knight advances. Creating a kingside pawn structure to challenge the central darkness, preparing for an eventual kingside attack. Circling back to the kingside, the knight seeks a more active post, potentially eyeing the f4 square and pressuring white's structure. Securing the c-file with the rook prepares a potential queenside pawn push or exchange maneuver. A prudent repositioning, safeguarding the monarch while subtly preparing to challenge the central pawn chain. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside, white boldly challenges black's cramped position. Expanding the queenside with b6 aims to create counterplay, but it subtly weakens the queenside pawn structure and could become a target for white's centralized pieces. Shielding the king from potential diagonal threats on the dark squares becomes paramount now. A repositioning maneuver aims to activate the knight on the kingside, perhaps preparing a central break or defensive reinforcement. Recapturing a central outpost for the knight offers better defensive coverage of the kingside, albeit with a loss of dynamism. A bold repositioning of the knight, seeking a more active outpost after the initial skirmish. Fortifying the bishop's influence, this maneuver aims to enhance queenside pressure by preparing a potential advance or supporting further pawn structure consolidation. Developing the bishop to d7 aims to connect the rooks and potentially challenge white's centralized pawn structure. Opening the B file might offer white attacking chances, though it also creates potential weaknesses in their own structure. Opening the B file offers attacking chances, but be mindful of potential counterplay on the king side after the exchange. Activating the bishop to pressure the knight's influence across the board. Repositioning the knight to its initial square concedes central space and invites potential queenside expansion by white. Securing the B file with this rook initiates a positional squeeze, preparing to infiltrate black's queenside and exploit the pawn chain's weaknesses. Shielding the rook and preparing to contest the open B file brings some much-needed activity to black's queenside. Repositioning the rook clears the second rank, anticipating a kingside initiative or preparing to contest the open C file should it materialize. Rerouting the knight to E8 signals a patient repositioning, aiming to bolster the kingside defense or perhaps prepare a later queenside counterstrike. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain, this rook prepares to swing across to the king's flank if the opportunity arises. Sacrificing the exchange opens lines, but it grants white a dominant rook and a powerful central pawn. Reactivating the rook on the now open file offers a fresh offensive avenue and supports further piece centralization. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, challenging white's central control and opening lines for attacking pieces. This queen redeployment prepares for a potential kingside attack, eyeing weaknesses around black's isolated knight. Unleashing the queen to a central outpost, potentially igniting complications or seeking safer squares amidst the pawn structure. Pivoting the knight to D1 aims to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps E3 or F2, to support potential central advances or defend the kingside. This maneuver unblocks the bishop, preparing a dynamic counterplay on the queen's side. Unlocking the queen's diagonal, white aims to exploit black's isolated pawns and potentially disrupt their queenside structure. Unleashing a pawn break to shatter the central pawn chain, accepting some structural concessions for dynamic counterplay. Activating the bishop to a commanding central diagonal, aiming to exploit the king's potential vulnerabilities. Challenging the central control, this bishop aims to disrupt white's piece harmony and open avenues for attack. Unleashing the bishop disrupts black's central control, creating an open diagonal for potential future attacks on the kingside. The knight reclaims central influence, preparing to join the attack on white's kingside pawn structure. Prioritizing king safety, white relocates the monarch to a more secure square, anticipating potential complications. Aims to reposition the queen, seeking greater activity and potential support for the kingside pawn push, while keeping the knight's defensive ties loose. Exposing black's monarch to potential pressure by activating the queen along the file. This move gracefully repositions the knight, creating a flexible pawn structure while preparing for a potential kingside defense. The queen's repositioning aims to exert pressure on the queenside and potentially support a kingside advance later. Reorienting the queen aims to activate a stalled army and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. Reorganizing the knights for potential central breakthrough. A critical repositioning aiming to contest the d-file, though it potentially opens lines for white's queen. Initiating a queenside expansion to claim the open file and disrupt black's pawn structure. Unlocking the d-file offers dynamic possibilities for the black rooks to infiltrate the queenside. Relocating the queen to the queenside broadens its influence, eyeing potential pawn advances while supporting the rook's newfound open file. Seeking refuge for the queen behind the rook seems like a passive response, perhaps aiming for a more unified defense. Ambitious pawn thrust to seize queenside space, potentially unraveling black's cramped position and opening new avenues for attack. Unleashing the advanced pawn aims to shatter white's central structure and exploit open lines for the queen. Maintaining the central tension, recapturing the bishop's pawn is a prudent defensive maneuver after the exchange. Unleashing a knight to the enemy's second rank, aiming to disrupt white's nascent attack and create attacking chances. Opening the h-file offers a direct assault on black's king, creating immediate tactical possibilities and disrupting any defensive pawn structure. Decisive check that opens lines for your queen and targets the exposed white king. Opening the f-file unleashes immense pressure on black's fractured king side. Sacrificing the bishop opens up the king's position, creating immediate tactical threats that demand precise defense. Unleashing a pawn storm to disrupt the black king's sanctuary. The bishop lands, seeking better diagonals after the pawn advances. Repositioning the queen to a more active file often signifies a preparation for decisive action. This bishop's retreat allows the knight to join the attack on the kingside pawns. Unifying the rooks creates a formidable barrier against black's advancing pawns and prepares a rook lift for decisive action. The knight's relocation to e8 creates a potential outpost on c7 and prepares to contest the open b-file. Reclaiming the open f-file is essential for white's attacking prospects. Seeking counterplay on the queen side, black attempts to open lines for the bishop, but this leaves the king slightly exposed. Shifting the rook to this file aims to disrupt black's passed pawn and seize newfound attacking potential. Asserting the central pawn with this thrust aims to disrupt white's cramped queenside and open lines for counterplay. King centralization offers counterplay, aiming to escape the rook's menacing pressure. A bold repositioning to contest the center and support potential breakthroughs for the queenside pieces. Reconnecting the rooks, this move prepares to challenge black's active bishop and reignite the queenside pressure. Reconnecting the bishop to the defense of the king becomes paramount, as the enemy attack presses on the queenside. Reasserting control over the open files becomes the priority, aiming to restrict black's active pieces. The pawn push bravely advances into enemy territory, a bold bid to fracture white's pawn structure. Reclaiming central space, the knight prepares to support potential kingside advances or bolster the pawn chain. Shifting the monarch now seems like a desperate attempt to escape an inevitable crush, but it only exposes further weaknesses. The queen repositions to pressure the pawn chain's weakest link, preparing a dynamic attack. Securing the king's safety amidst the storm is paramount for navigating these complex exchanges. Recentering the knight to e2 offers fresh attacking avenues and supports a potential kingside advance. Shifting the queen to target white's exposed king offers fresh attacking possibilities. Unleashing a devastating discovered check that rips open the kingside and forces critical decisions. Shifting the queen to create a potent battery along the g-file aims to disrupt white's defensive setup. Preserving the queen's engagement on the 8th rank maintains crucial pressure. Renouncing further defense of the d7 pawn, black redirects the queen to a square where it can potentially support a later breakthrough or escape. A calculated retreat to consolidate defenses and prepare for a renewed assault. Sacrificing the bishop on d2 offers no immediate tactical advantage and leaves the king exposed. Seizing the pawn opens a potent avenue for the queen to infiltrate black's weakened queenside. Capturing that knight opens a critical diagonal for the queen, though it might expose your own king. Reclaiming the central file pressure after the exchange might be white's best bet to disrupt black's active pieces. The rook's retreat to the open file suddenly secures the c-pawn's defense, a crucial step in holding the position. Initiating an attack on black's exposed king, aiming to break through the weakened defensive structure. Relinquishing the central square and the bishop pair further solidifies white's spatial advantage, but black aims to disrupt white's plans by offering a trade of queens. Checking the king's safety with a forcing queen check, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. The attacker hesitates, allowing the defense to solidify its position and potentially escape the impending pressure. Reclaiming central space opens lines and challenges black's exposed king. A calculated exchange to simplify, aiming to exploit white's exposed monarch in the coming phases. A decisive recapture, opening lines and solidifying the rook's influence on the critical open file. a desperate bid to disrupt the imposing white rook on the 7th rank, seeking counterplay through a potential pawn advance. Pushing the rook to the 5th rank aims to support the eventual pawn advance and pressure black's weakened queenside. Consolidating the rook on the open file prepares for a decisive pawn push toward the enemy king. Activating the knight to a central outpost, it immediately pressures black's compromised pawn structure and prepares for further infantry advances. The king ventures out, a bold step to join the fight for central influence. Striking the knight opens a decisive diagonal for the queen and forces a pawn endgame that is overwhelmingly favorable for white. Finally, the black king ventures into the open, seeking active participation while risking exposure. Relocating the king to safety is a prudent step given the open nature of the board. A desperate attempt to reroute the bishop to a more active square, though the king remains exposed. The monarch abandons its shelter, embracing a perilous central position to counter black's bishop. Unleashing a check that forces the enemy monarch into an exposed square, a bold attempt to disrupt white's coordinated pieces. A determined attempt to finally bring the rook into the fray, aiming to unblock the king's desperate need for support. Consolidating the rook to the central files now offers better coordination against white's isolated pawn. Consolidating, the king initiates a defensive restructuring to weather the coming pressure. Securing the g7 bishop's retreat path while preparing to develop the rook further up the board. Seizing the pawn opens a dangerous path towards the black king, exposing critical weaknesses. The rook sacrifice opens the bishop, but the pawn capture is a swift end to black's hopes. Seizing the open file dramatically simplifies the endgame, aiming for pawn promotion. The black king, exposed and alone, now ventures into the heart of a battlefield still littered with skirmishing pieces. Activating the rook to its strongest potential on the open file is paramount now. A final rook maneuver, aiming to bolster the defense of the king against white's menacing knight. Reclaiming the open file provides breathing room and prepares to advance the rook to more active squares. A desperate attempt to untangle the rook and potentially counterattack, but it leaves the king exposed to the encroaching white pieces. Seizing a pawn with the rook now clears the path for a decisive kingside sweep. Securing the rook on the 7th rank opens avenues for white's pawns to advance further, creating immediate threats. Activating the rook to harass the black king and disrupt its defenses on the open c-file. Sacrificing material to gain initiative is a risky, but sometimes necessary tactic in pawnless endgames. The rook's march to a7 is a final pounce, aiming to sever the black king's escape. Unleashing the rook to contest the open file, aiming to disrupt white's promotion aspirations. Shifting the king forward now aims to support the pawn push and possibly create escape squares for it. Sensing a glimmer of hope, black endeavors to bring the rook into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's menacing king. Pressing the advantage, the rook swings across to target the vulnerable black king. The king's exposed position allows for immediate pressure and a potential breakthrough. Securing the final pawn with the rook clears a path for white's remaining pieces to participate in the endgame. Capturing the pawn allows white to finally secure a passed pawn on the file, a dangerous weapon in this simplified endgame. King activity is paramount now, so this royal march initiates the final pursuit of black's remaining pawns. Securing the rook on the 7th rank guarantees a draw by perpetual check if the opponent plays carelessly. Pushing the king forward now aims to exploit the exposed black monarch in the endgame. The king scrambles for safety, but the rook's advanced position creates a decisive mating net. A final reshuffle for queenside pawns, aiming to create a passed threat. Seizing the active rook allows black to prepare a defense of the vulnerable kingside pawns. Pressing the isolated black king with the rook exploits the pinned pawn, forcing further concessions. Exploiting the open file forces the king into a dangerous central square, aiming to create mating threats. The king abandons the defended dark squares, venturing into an exposed territory where pawns still stand. A clever repositioning, the rook now supports the knight's potential advance and eyes the open king file, initiating a decisive pawn march toward promotion to seize the advantage. The king's exposed position allows for an immediate mating attack after this move. A swift repositioning to exploit the exposed black king and secure victory. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers a glimmer of hope in a truly desperate situation. King's safety is paramount as the rooks prepare for a final assault on the weakened queenside pawns. The king's safety is paramount now. It must retreat to avoid being cornered. Unleashing a pawn advance to seize control of vital central squares and initiate a decisive queenside push. The black king must flee this exposed square, seeking refuge behind the advancing pawns. Escorting the monarch to greater safety on the kingside provides a critical defensive bastion. The king's escape route is now decisively blocked, forcing a confrontation in the center with limited options. Pushing the pawn offers a last-ditch attempt to tie down black's king and create some tactical chaos. The king's newfound activity is a double-edged sword, risking exposure as pawns disappear. Asserting the open file with the rook, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. The king's journey to the center finally finds its destination, preparing to support the final pawn push in this endgame. Seizing the open file with the rook provides a clear path to victory. King's safety is paramount now. The monarch must actively seek shelter and support from its remaining soldiers. Igniting the pawn's final push promises to be a decisive blow, forcing a critical decision for the black king. Snaring the king with a rook check is the immediate goal, disrupting white's pawn advance and forcing a tactical response. The king's final march, aiming to secure the 7th rank, signals the endgame's inevitable conclusion. The monarch's escape route is now cut off, creating a dangerous situation for the black king. A forcing check to disrupt the black king's shelter and gain tempo. The king's sanctuary shattered, white desperately seeks perpetual check with the rook and queen. Unleashing the king's power, this bold advance into enemy territory aims to support the pawn and hunt down remaining black pieces. Seeking to disrupt the opponent's king's safety, the knight's discovered check aims to force a concession. This king maneuver finally escapes the perpetual checks and positions the monarch for support, a crucial defensive step. The black king, exposed and cornered, must now endure a final, agonizing dance. Securing the king by retreating to the safety of the pawn formation is paramount for white now. Pressuring the g-file with the rook aims to exploit the exposed monarch and is a sound decision in this endgame scenario. Leveraging the discovered attack, white forces the win by repositioning the rook to create irresistible mating threats.